Let's sip some tea and talk about the Dark Ages. So first of all, that name is very misleading. This period is what scholars like to refer to as the early medieval period. It was roughly 500 to 1000 AD, and it gets labeled as this backwards, intellectually dead, everyone was dirty, gross, not bathing, everything was culturally stagnant era, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire with the deposing of the last Western Roman emperor. But it actually wasn't dark in the way that we were taught. It was dark in Western Europe because centralized Roman infrastructure collapsed, which meant trade networks were shrinking and literacy rates were dropping, massive public works projects completely slowed down and went away, wealth consolidated into feudal systems, and local warlords replaced imperial administration. But also, in the Eastern Roman Empire, what we know as the Byzantine Empire, that was hanging on. We also have the Islamic Golden Age exploding with advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, etc., etc. And at the same time, the monasteries were preserving ancient texts and intellectual property, and major innovations in agriculture along with new political systems were happening. So why do we call this dark? Honestly, it's because of ego. So later on, the Renaissance thinkers, they wanted to frame themselves as the light returning after a long intellectual night. It was branding and marketing and PR, probably from a man. The point is that framing shaped how we think about collapse and the decline of an empire. So we all tend to think about things in a very linear way, which is confusing and honestly why so many people struggle with critically thinking about history. It's also why so many people think slavery and Jim Crow and Reconstruction and segregation, it was like 400 years ago. The US is not that old. We are 250 years old. Now let's do my favorite thing. Zoom out and look at the big picture. So what actually defines a dark age? It is usually not the total disappearance of knowledge. We see fragmentation and institutional breakdowns with wealth consolidation, it's public infrastructure declining while power becomes hyper-local or hyper-private, it's massive class stratification. Please tell me this all sounds familiar. So when empires strain under inequality and corruption, overextension, public goods are eroding, roads, schools, libraries, social safety nets, they start to decline, and private wealth increases while collective investment is shrinking. This is very much part of a cycle. So eventually capital pools at the top and becomes so concentrated that legitimacy becomes really fragile. Historically, there are a few outcomes at this point of severe inequality. Revolt and burn it all down, reformation and restorative justice, or fund a renaissance. And I do mean fund a renaissance. The Medici family and other wealthy members of the merchant classes, the church and European royalty, they would pour money into art, science, architecture, public buildings, scholarships, universities, other civic projects, etc., etc. Now remember what I said about cycles. We are living in a moment of extreme wealth concentration, the largest since the Gilded Age. The signs are there. We have infrastructure strain, institutional distrust, cultural fragmentation, information overload, AI disrupting labor. It feels unstable and chaotic. Many people call this decline because many of us feel it really heavy. And these periods of quote unquote decline are historically transitional periods that happen because when class inequity peaks, the system either hardens into something more feudal or it has to shift because you cannot sustain insane levels of inequality and inequity. As we continue with this cycle, we see throughout history this very thing. All of this leads to a period where reputational capital becomes more valuable than raw wealth accumulation, which means elites often start funding legacy projects like universities, museums, philanthropy, public works, technological innovations, cultural patronage, etc. Not out of altruism, but because legacy stabilizes power, and it's kind of like how Becca Bloom is trying to get us to find billionaires and stark wealth inequity palatable and aesthetic. Her fans might be like, that's not what she's doing, but come on, that's what she's doing. And she's clapping back at people who call her out for this because she, like all of the wealthy are showing us in the cycle, they actually do want reputational capital. Yeah, they will do the vilest stuff and think they can get away with it, and they do lack a certain amount of groundedness, consciousness, empathy, and awareness, but they don't want to actually be hated because then revolt becomes much more likely to be on the table. At the end of the day, everyone cares what you think about them as a collective. That is just the tea. The literal tea. Anyways, back to that cycle. So when enough capital flows back into public-facing infrastructure, you get these cultural explosions, which gives us that Renaissance energy. Art and science, reimagined governance, new worldviews, new cosmologies, new inventions and creations. We're in a liminal space that's not quite collapse and not quite rebirth, it's transition. But we know history is cyclical. Remember this cycle I'm talking about. We are likely heading toward a restructuring of who funds what, who builds what, who gets access to knowledge, and this suppressing of anger towards inequity and concentration through essentially pretty distractions and perceived care and atonement. As the daughter of a narcissist, this pattern is so obvious to me. The Dark Ages, they weren't the end of civilization. We can see that. They were this messy transition between power structures. And every messy transition is going to hold the seeds of a renaissance and the possibility and potential of it. But also, we have astrology happening that has never happened in recorded history, with Saturn and Neptune conjunct in Aries, along with the fact that we are in the Pluto returns of the United States, historically when empires fall, and we have Pluto in Aquarius. What I'm saying is, I'm piecing together a pattern, but nothing is actually black and white or cut and dry and predictable to me. What we need to do right now is be present and aware of how the public is historically quelled and controlled to avoid the wealthy elite losing their status, essentially having to answer for what their true actions are as opposed to their pretty distractions and yada yada and people pedestaling them. But what I'm also saying is we truly don't know what could happen, but all of history is made up of people making decisions and deciding what to do and banding together. And we've reached this apex point of things just being completely unsustainable, unbearable, and disgusting, especially here in the US, right? This is a really good time to be well-versed in history and to also understand we have a lot more say and control in how things go, and don't give up your agency in this process. Let's piece together those dots. Let's keep zooming out and looking at the big picture, shall we? Until next time, y'all.